7th and 8th grade, welcome to our last content day of week 6. We've journeyed through some difficult topics, and I hope and pray that you've had people in your context to talk with you about what you've been learning. I just want to remind us of one of the most important lessons learned this school year. It is okay to have questions and doubts about our faith. We can do so because God gives us two huge hopes to stand on. First, He welcomes us with all of our confusing thoughts. But secondly, He also gives us His Word, which, according to Peter, has everything we need for life and godliness. It is a book of answers for life's most difficult and challenging questions. And we've seen that there's no other worldview that can produce such clarity as our own Christian faith can. And this week, we've looked at three important sticky topics, and we've discussed what God's design is. Now, though I haven't given many examples, I'm sure that you are very well aware of how God's design has been messed up and twisted in big and small ways in our world today. Gender, marriage, and life are all key topics that worldview differences become painfully clear by. When we replace God with humanity at the center of our worldview, we step outside of His clarity and blessing. At the same time, we saw that the gospel, the good news of Jesus, brings hope and grace and purpose to all of us, no matter how far or close we stay to God's design. God's love always pursues us. Today, we will talk about God's view on life. And this is so important. All over the human timeline, life is being threatened. On the one side, we have abortion. If humanity is at the center of a worldview, then pregnancy is less important than human convenience. In an abortion, an actual human life is killed for the sake of that convenience. And on the other end of the timeline, we see the elderly are being euthanized. It's a fancy word that means under the supervision of a doctor, they're killed because they or others believe that their life is useless or purposeless. And in the middle, we hear news of stories daily about terrible killings. Small or large amounts of people in our nation around the world die. Now, you might be surprised, but God has an awful lot to say about what life is and what we are called to do with that. The Bible thoroughly covers the topic of life. In Genesis, we learn that God is the author of life. In Psalm 139, we read that God's gift of life is not careless but intentional. In Ecclesiastes, we read over and over again that we are called to enjoy life. And in the entirety of the Bible, life is celebrated and protected by God and His people. Life is a gift. It's not ours to give. It is definitely not ours to take. No, it is God's gift to us. So if life flows from God, then it must have an opposite, just as God has an opposite. Similarly, as sin is the opposite from God, so is death the opposite of life. And sin results in death, physical or spiritual. The third human that sinned was Cain. Cain killed Abel because of the sin of jealousy in his heart. Death is the direct result of sin in this world. Finally, if life is from God and sin results in death, then believers must be the greatest grace-filled champions for life at the beginning, middle, and end of the human timeline. There is much more that we could say about this, but for now, let's close this topic by looking at the mission of Jesus as described in John chapter 20. John writes that Jesus came to give life, not just an extension of the temporal life on earth, but that through believing in Jesus, we would experience eternal life in heaven where death will be no more, and we will experience perfect life in a sinless world. Again, there's much more that we could say about this, but for now, I'd love to close out our video with a brief now what. You've learned about 6 different worldviews and 3 very sticky topics. Now, we could have done many more, but that's how much time we had left in this year. But how is that knowledge going to make us stronger believers, and how will we become more in love with Jesus than ever before and radiate that love to others around us? Now, we are called to be reflectors of who God is. Now, you and I become better reflectors the more that we learn about who God is. And this year we have grown in our knowledge of God, and it's my biggest prayer that we will have become more like Him. So the natural question is, how do we reflect that knowledge? How should we tune the lighthouse of our Christian testimony to more effectively showcase Christ in a world that believes many different worldviews than the true one? So in closing, let's turn again to the example of Jesus. In John chapter 1, Jesus is described as the perfect God reflector. In fact, he is God himself. But how did Jesus go about reflecting God? How did he show God to the world so perfectly? Well, in John chapter 1, verse 14, we read that is done through his grace and truth. He did it with grace, with warm forgiveness and unrelenting love. And he did it with truth, shining the bright light of what is right and wrong into people's hearts and into the world around them. He did not do it with grace or truth. No, he used his perfect knowledge of God to interact with this world with grace and truth in perfect balance. Now, you and I are called to do the same. We are called to use our newfound worldview knowledge to be bright beacons of God's grace and truth, to love with our head and our hearts in the same way that God has loved us, and to radiate the warm love of Christ's love and passion for us to a world that desperately needs it.